I never imagined Easter dinner would end with blood running down my face and a police report being filed in my own home. One demand at my table revealed what my own son and his wife were quietly planning for my house, my savings, and my future. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I stayed calm, and I set something in motion that night that none of them saw coming. Before I tell you exactly how that evening unfolded, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. These stories travel farther when people who've lived them help share them. My name is Arthur Hale. I'm 64 years old. I retired 4 years ago after running a small bookkeeping and tax practice for most of my adult life. I wasn't wealthy, but I was careful, consistent, the kind of man who believes security is built slowly, not loudly. My wife, Margaret, passed away 6 years ago after a long illness. When you lose someone like that, life doesn't explode, it thins out. The house gets quieter. Meals become smaller. You start talking to yourself without noticing. Since her death, I've lived alone in a home we bought back in the early 1990s in Maple Ridge, a quiet town that used to be affordable and somehow became expensive without asking permission. We paid $160,000 for the house. Today, agents say it's worth close to $2 million, not because it's special, but because the world around it changed. I stayed because it was home. Every hallway held memory. Every cupboard still knew her hands. My son Ethan is 33. He works in medical sales. He's smart, ambitious, and very good at sounding confident. He married Claire 3 years ago. They have 2 children, Sophie 9 and Miles 6. The kids are good kids. Curious. Honest. They still hug me without checking the room first. Ethan and Claire live about an hour away in a newer suburb. Clean streets, identical houses, mortgages that look manageable until you add everything else. I see them once a month, sometimes less. But holidays? I always host. Always have. It was something Margaret insisted on. If they come home, she used to say, they'll remember who they are. That Easter, I did everything the way she would have. I cooked lamb with rosemary and garlic, roasted vegetables. I baked hot cross buns using her old recipe card, the one with her handwriting slanting slightly to the right. I hid chocolate eggs in the backyard for the kids. The house smelled warm again, alive. They arrived just after 3. Ethan's car pulled into the driveway, and I watched from the kitchen window as Claire stepped out holding a bottle of wine. Expensive label. Deep red glass. She only brings things like that when she's preparing to ask for something. I didn't realize the pattern back then. I do now. Ethan hugged me quickly. Too quickly. Claire kissed my cheek, perfume heavy, smile polished. The kids ran straight to me, shouting about school projects and Easter candy. For a moment, it felt normal. We sat in the living room instead of going straight to dinner. That alone should have warned me. Ethan never lingers. He's always halfway elsewhere. Emails, calls, numbers spinning behind his eyes. That day, he was focused, alert, watching Claire like they were reading from the same invisible script. Dad, he said, clearing his throat, we've been talking about your situation. My situation. The phrase landed heavier than it should have. He talked about the house being big, about me living alone. Claire leaned forward, nodding, adding concerns about safety, about falls, about what would happen if something went wrong and no one was there. Concern can sound sincere, but it can also sound strategic. Then Claire mentioned her parents. They had sold their place. Housing prices were insane. They needed somewhere temporary, somewhere affordable, somewhere with space. She said it gently, casually, as if it were already decided. They wanted them to move into my house. 2 bedrooms. Rent, of course. Family helping family, she said, smiling tightly. I didn't answer right away. I watched Ethan. He avoided my eyes. When I finally said no, calmly, clearly, the air shifted. Claire pushed back. Ethan talked about practicality, about my age, about the future. I said no again. Dinner happened anyway. Polite, tight, forks too loud against plates. The kids sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. Then Claire snapped. She accused me of hoarding space, of being selfish, of still living like Margaret was going to walk through the door any minute. That one landed hard, but I stayed seated. I stayed quiet. And when I still didn't give in, she picked up her wine glass and threw it. Red wine, shattered glass, a sharp sting above my eyebrow. Blood, silence. That was the moment everything changed. And that was only the beginning. That night after they left, the house felt different. Not empty, heavier. Like the walls themselves had heard what was said and were waiting to see what I would do next. I cleaned the dining room slowly. Not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something steady to do. I wiped wine from the wall, swept glass into a dustpan, changed my shirt. The cut above my eyebrow wasn't deep, but head wounds bleed dramatically. Every glance in the mirror looked worse than it was. When the house was quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the place where Claire's glass had shattered. Margaret used to say broken glass at a table meant truth had been forced out. I never believed in superstitions, but that night it felt uncomfortably accurate. What Ethan and Claire didn't know was that Easter dinner wasn't the first time something had fell off. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call from my bank. Nothing dramatic. No alarms. Just a polite verification request. Someone had attempted to access my investment account online. They hadn't succeeded, but they'd gotten close enough to trigger a security review. The access attempt used personal details most strangers wouldn't have. My birth date, Margaret's maiden name, the answer to an old security question I hadn't used in years. The IP address traced back to a residential connection registered under Ethan's name. When the banker asked if I'd been trying to log in from a new device, I said no. My voice didn't shake. My stomach did. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't accuse anyone. I called an estate attorney named Gregory Lawson, a man Margaret and I had worked with years earlier when we first updated our wills. He specialized in elder financial protection before moving into estate planning. When I explained the situation, he didn't sound surprised. Arthur, he said, this happens more often than people want to admit. Adult children don't usually start with outright theft. They start with concern. They test access. They test influence. They see what they can move without resistance. What do? I asked. You document. You protect. And you wait. Over the next 3 months, we did exactly that. I underwent a full cognitive assessment with a geriatric specialist. Passed every test cleanly. The report stated in no uncertain terms that I was mentally competent, independent, and capable of managing my affairs. Gregory helped me update my will with strict language. Any attempt to challenge my competence or contest the will would result in forfeiture. No exceptions. No second chances. We placed my assets into a living trust with clear conditions and independent oversight. And finally, this part made me uncomfortable, but I agreed. We installed discrete security cameras in my living room, dining room, and kitchen. If something escalates, Gregory said, you'll want evidence, not emotion. I didn't want to believe I'd ever need them. Easter proved him right. The morning after dinner, I woke up sore and exhausted. My phone was full of missed calls and messages. Ethan, Claire, some apologetic, some defensive, all asking to talk. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to Gregory's office. He watched the footage with me. The entire dinner. The escalation. Claire throwing the wine. Ethan hesitating instead of stopping her. My calm exit. This is clear, Gregory said. Unprovoked. On video. You did nothing wrong. I don't want to destroy my son, I said quietly. I know, he replied. But you also can't allow this to continue. We discussed options. Police report. Restraining order. Formal documentation of the attempted account access. Gregory was careful not to push me toward any decision. He laid out consequences, not ultimatums. By the time I left his office, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Certainty. That afternoon, I went to urgent care. The cut was cleaned and closed. Minor injury. No concussion. The nurse asked if I felt safe at home. I said yes, but I asked for the incident to be documented. Paper trails matter. The police contacted me 2 days later. Claire had admitted to throwing the wine, but claimed she was overwhelmed and didn't mean to hurt anyone. The officer explained that because I was over 60 and the incident occurred in my home, elder abuse considerations applied. I didn't feel like a victim, but I understood the gravity. A no-contact order was issued against Claire pending further review. Ethan showed up at my door that Friday. I didn't invite him in. He looked exhausted. Guilt sat on him like a weight he wasn't built to carry. "Dad," he said, "this has gone too far." "No," I replied calmly. "It went too far at my table." He tried to explain. Financial pressure, childcare costs, her parents needing help, everything framed as necessity. I listened. I always had. When he finished, I said, "You try to access my accounts without permission." He froze. "I was worried," he said. "I thought maybe you were slipping." I handed him a copy of my cognitive assessment. He didn't look at it for long. "If you ever try something like that again," I continued, "you're out of my will entirely. The kids will be provided for. You will not." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. "I raised you better than this," I said softly, "which means you know exactly why what you did was wrong." He left without arguing. Weeks passed. Claire's charges moved forward. Ethan sent letters. Apologies layered with excuses. I didn't respond. I spent my days quietly, walking, reading, taking care of the house. For the first time since Margaret passed, I felt like the space belonged to me again, not as something to be claimed, but as something protected. One afternoon, I found a crayon drawing in my mailbox. Sophie's handwriting. Stick figures holding hands. "I miss you, Grandpa." I cried longer than I wanted to admit, but I didn't reach out, because boundaries aren't punishments. They're protection. And the hardest part was still coming. The silence after Ethan stopped coming felt unnatural at first, not peaceful, watchful, like the calm before weather turns. I kept expecting my phone to ring with another apology, another explanation dressed up as concern. But weeks passed, and instead of words, actions began to surface. It started with my bank. One Tuesday morning, I received a call from the fraud department asking me to confirm whether I had authorized a request for copies of my trust documents. The request hadn't been approved, but someone had tried to obtain information under the guise of family coordination. I didn't need to ask who. I called Gregory immediately. "They're escalating," he said after listening carefully. "When access fails, they look for leverage. Documents, authority, narratives." "What kind of narrative?" I asked. "That you're no longer capable of managing your affairs." That sentence sat heavy. Within days, I learned Ethan had contacted 2 of my neighbors asking whether they'd noticed changes in me. One neighbor mentioned it casually while we were talking about lawn maintenance. She hadn't thought much of it until she realized the question wasn't concern. It was probing. I began keeping a log. Dates, calls, messages, third-party inquiries. Gregory had warned me that patterns mattered more than single incidents. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a politely worded notice stating that concerns have been raised regarding my ongoing ability to live independently, and that a voluntary evaluation or temporary guardianship discussion could avoid unnecessary conflict. Guardianship. I read the word 3 times. This wasn't about Easter dinner anymore. This wasn't about bruised feelings or financial stress. This was about control. I drove straight to Gregory's office with the letter shaking in my hand. "This," he said calmly after reading it, "is exactly why we prepared." He explained the strategy plainly. Guardianship cases succeed when the target appears isolated, undocumented, or unprepared. I was none of those things. We responded formally, included my recent medical assessments, financial statements showing independent management, affidavits from my physician, my accountant, and even my book club coordinator attesting to my engagement and clarity. We also requested discovery. If Ethan wanted to raise questions about my competence, we wanted to know precisely what evidence he thought he had. 2 weeks later, the answer arrived. Ethan had submitted a sworn statement claiming I was emotionally unstable, increasingly paranoid, and unable to distinguish genuine concern from hostility. He cited my refusal to allow Claire's parents to move in, my decision to limit contact, and my overreaction to a minor family disagreement. Reading my own life reduced to accusations made my hands tremble, not with fear, but disbelief. Gregory leaned back in his chair. He's trying to weaponize your boundaries. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we let him prove it. We filed a counter-statement attaching video footage from Easter dinner. The wine, the glass, the blood, the police report, the no-contact order, the attempted account access logs. Then we requested that Ethan submit to financial disclosure. If he wanted to question my competence, his motives would be examined too. That's when things unraveled quickly. The court-appointed evaluator contacted Ethan for documentation, bank statements, loan agreements, credit reports. Within days, Gregory received a call. They found something, he said. Ethan had significant unsecured debt, credit cards, personal loans, missed payments, a line of credit nearly maxed out. None of it catastrophic on its own, but together it painted a picture of pressure. More importantly, the evaluator discovered Ethan had discussed housing solutions with a real estate consultant, specifically how transferring my property into a family-managed trust could optimize liquidity. Liquidity. My house wasn't a home to them. It was leverage. The guardianship petition was quietly withdrawn 2 days later. No apology, no explanation. Just gone. But the damage was already done. Claire's no-contact order remained in place. Ethan's attempt to reframe himself as a concerned son collapsed under scrutiny, and the court made a note, one that would follow him if he ever tried again. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. That Sunday, I visited Margaret's grave alone. I told her everything I hadn't said out loud yet, about how our son had tried to turn love into entitlement, about how choosing myself felt both right and unbearably lonely. I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that. The next week, I finalized changes Gregory and I had discussed months earlier. Education trust for the grandchildren, managed independently. My house placed firmly inside the trust with conditions that made forced sale impossible during my lifetime. Medical directives naming people who were not family. I wasn't cutting my son out. I was removing his ability to hurt me. Ethan sent one final email after the guardianship filing was dismissed. I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the laptop. Intent doesn't erase impact. I didn't reply. Life settled into something quieter after that. Predictable. Safe. And then one afternoon, I ran into Claire's mother at the grocery store. She avoided my eyes. That told me everything I needed to know. The truth had reached them too. And it wasn't finished yet. The guardianship attempt didn't end things. It only changed the tactics. After Ethan withdrew the petition, there was a brief lull. 2 weeks where nothing happened. No calls. No letters. No sudden concerned check-ins from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. On the surface, it looked like retreat. Gregory warned me not to relax. People who lose power rarely accept it quietly, he said. They look for a different angle. That angle appeared in the form of silence that wasn't empty. It was strategic. The first sign came from my insurance company. They called to verify a recent change request involving my homeowner's policy. Someone had attempted to list an additional adult occupant as a long-term resident and requested updated valuation documents on the property. I asked who submitted the request. They couldn't say directly, but they did say it came from an email address I recognized instantly, one Ethan used for professional correspondence. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table staring at the wood grain, like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. He couldn't control me legally anymore, so he was trying to create a paper trail, a record, something that suggested shared residency, shared responsibility, shared authority, a foothold. I forwarded everything to Gregory. He's trying to establish implied consent, he said. If he can show even partial administrative involvement, It gives him something to argue later. So, what do? We cut the thread cleanly. That afternoon, Gregory drafted cease and desist notices. Not emotional, not threatening, just precise. One to Ethan, one to his wife's parents, one to the insurance provider clarifying that no third party was authorized to make changes on my behalf. Then we did something else. We documented intent. Gregory explained that courts look not only at what someone does, but what they attempt repeatedly after being told no. Patterns matter. Persistence matters. So we started collecting everything. Every unauthorized inquiry. Every indirect contact. Every attempt to modify my life without my consent. And the more we collected, the clearer the picture became. Ethan wasn't acting alone. His wife's parents, who had remained quiet since Easter, were suddenly active. Calls to municipal offices asking about zoning allowances. Questions about multi-generational housing compliance. Even an inquiry about whether my neighborhood allowed secondary suites. All without ever speaking to me. I felt something that surprised me. Not fear, but a sharp, clean anger. They weren't worried about me. They were planning around me. One evening, as I was closing the blinds, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Not directly in front of my house. Just close enough to watch. It stayed there for 40 minutes. I noted the time, the license plate, the fact that the driver never got out. When it left, I checked my security footage. Claire, sitting in the passenger seat. Her father driving. I didn't confront them. I documented it. The following week, Gregory escalated. He filed a formal notice asserting harassment and interference with personal affairs. Not a lawsuit, yet, but a legal marker, a line in the sand. That's when Ethan finally broke his silence. He called from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. His voice sounded tired, not apologetic, just frustrated. Dad, this is getting out of hand. Lawyers, letters, accusations. We were just trying to help. You're blowing this up into something it doesn't need to be. I listened twice. Then I deleted it. Gregory said something important that day. Notice how he frames it. Not, I cross a line, but you overreacted. That's not remorse. That's resentment. 2 days later, the retaliation came. Ethan filed a civil claim, not for guardianship, not for control, but for reimbursement. He claimed I owed him money. For what? Unpaid contributions, the filing said. Time, labor, and opportunity costs incurred while assisting with parental care and estate planning. I laughed when Gregory read it aloud. Then I stopped laughing. Because while the claim was weak, it was intentional. Lawsuits don't need to be strong to be disruptive. They just need to exist. The claim alleged that Ethan had provided unpaid services over several years, helping with errands, researching care options, managing family logistics. In exchange, he implied he had been promised future consideration. It was fiction, dangerous fiction. We responded with evidence. Receipts showing I paid for my own services. Emails where I declined help. Witness statements from neighbors and friends confirming my independence. And then Gregory did something unexpected. He filed a counterclaim. Not for damages, for declaratory judgment. We asked the court to formally recognize that Ethan had no financial, residential, or decision-making authority over me or my assets, now or in the future. That changed everything. Because now, Ethan wasn't the aggressor. He was the one being examined. Discovery began. And discovery is ruthless. Ethan was required to disclose financial records, communications related to my property, and correspondence with third parties regarding my estate. That's when the contradictions surfaced. Emails we referred to my house as eventually ours. Messages to his in-laws discussing when Robert moves out. A draft spreadsheet titled Transition Plan outlining timelines that assume my absence. Not death. Absence. The judge didn't hide his reaction. During a procedural hearing, he asked Ethan a single question. Mr. Collins, did your father ever agree to this plan? Ethan hesitated. No, he admitted, but we believed. The judge raised a hand. Belief does not equal consent. That sentence felt like oxygen. The reimbursement claim was dismissed shortly afterward. Not only dismissed, but flagged as frivolous. And then came the ruling on the declaratory judgment. Clear, direct, unambiguous. Ethan had no claim, no authority, no expectation. Any further attempts to interfere would be considered harassment. The court didn't need to raise its voice. It didn't need to punish. It simply closed the door. After that, the noise stopped. No parked cars. No inquiries. No letters. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a door slamming shut on the wrong people. I expected relief. What I felt instead was grief. Not for the relationship I had lost, that had been slipping away long before Easter, but for the illusion I'd held on to. The belief that love, once established, couldn't be converted into leverage. I learned the hard way that it can. Weeks passed. Life normalized again. I went back to my routines. My walks. My classes. My evenings spent reading instead of bracing. One afternoon, a card arrived in the mail. Crayon handwriting. I miss you, Grandpa. No return address. I sat with that card for a long time. Then I placed it in the drawer where I kept the trust documents. Not as evidence. As motivation. Because this wasn't over. Not in the ways that mattered. The legal war had ended, but the emotional fallout was just beginning. The court ruling should have ended it. Legally it did. But life doesn't follow court calendars. For a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. No calls from Ethan. No messages. No checking in. Not even the passive-aggressive silence I'd grown used to. Just nothing. At first, I thought that meant acceptance. Gregory didn't. People don't abandon plans like that, he said. They regroup. I didn't want to believe him, but experience had taught me something important. When people stop pushing directly, they start working sideways. The sideways push came through people I hadn't spoken to in years. It started with a phone call from a distant cousin. Someone I saw maybe once every 5 Christmases. "Hey, Robert," she said, voice cautious. "I heard things were difficult with your son." I asked what she'd heard. There was a pause. Then, that you've been struggling. Memory issues. That Ethan tried to help, and you shut him out. People are worried. People. That word again. By the end of that week, I heard similar versions from 3 different directions. Old colleagues. A former neighbor. Even someone from my book club gently asked if I was doing okay and whether I had support. The story was being told without me in it. Ethan hadn't challenged the court ruling. He hadn't violated the order. Instead, he'd done something far more subtle. He'd rewritten the narrative. In his version, I wasn't malicious or stubborn. I was confused, proud, unaware of my own decline. And he, poor, patient son, had been forced to step back after being shut out by lawyers. It was clever, because sympathy travels faster than truth. Gregory warned me this would happen. Once legal leverage fails, people turn to social pressure. If enough people believe a story, it becomes real enough to cause damage. What kind of damage? I asked. The kind that isolates you, makes you doubt yourself, makes institutions hesitate. That part came next. I received a letter from my primary care clinic requesting a routine wellness follow-up. That wasn't unusual on its own, except for the note attached. We receive an external concern regarding patient well-being. External concern. I knew exactly where it came from. I booked the appointment immediately. The doctor, a woman I'd seen for years, was professional but cautious. She asked questions she'd never asked before. About forgetfulness. About decision-making. About support systems. I answered calmly. Clearly. Honestly. At the end, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You seem fine." Not reassured. Not confident. Just surprised. I asked her directly if someone had contacted the clinic. She hesitated, then nodded. A family member expressed concern. About what specifically? She glanced at the screen. That you might be resistant to help. I smiled thinly. That was a phrase Ethan loved. Resistant to help. The way people say non-compliant when they mean won't do what I want. I authorized a full evaluation on the spot. Cognitive, emotional, Functional. Everything. Not because I needed it. Because I wanted documentation. 2 weeks later, the results came back pristine. The doctor apologized. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have trusted my own assessment. I told her something important." "You did. You just let someone else's fear override it. That's how manipulation works. It borrows authority from concern." The evaluation report went straight to Gregory. He added it to the growing file. By then, the file had weight. Not just pages, but gravity. And it was about to matter. Because Ethan made his next move in public. I found out from a neighbor. He knocked on my door one afternoon, uneasy. "Robert," he said, "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but your son's been asking around." "About what?" "About selling. He told someone you were considering downsizing, and that he was handling logistics." That sentence settled in my chest like a stone. Handling logistics. I thanked my neighbor and closed the door. Then I sat down and let the anger arrive properly this time. Not hot, not explosive. Cold, focused. I called Gregory. "He's telling people I'm selling." Gregory exhaled slowly. "That's not just harassment anymore. That's misrepresentation." "What do? We stopped playing defense." Within 48 hours, Gregory sent formal notices to every entity Ethan had contacted, real estate offices, clinics, insurers, stating clearly and unequivocally that any representations made by Ethan regarding my intentions were false and unauthorized. Then he did something else. He sent a letter to Ethan directly, not a warning, an invitation, to cease all third-party communications regarding Robert Collins' health, finances, or property immediately, or we will pursue injunctive relief and damages for reputational harm. It was surgical, and it worked for about a week. Then Ethan made a mistake, a big one. He emailed a real estate agent, someone Gregory happened to know professionally, and asked for a quiet valuation of my property, stating that I was not ready to be involved yet. The agent forwarded the email to Gregory within an hour. That was the moment everything tipped. Because now we had intent, not speculation, not concern, planning. Gregory filed an emergency motion, not dramatic, not aggressive, precise. We asked the court for a protective order barring Ethan from contacting or representing himself to any third party regarding me or my assets. We included the email. The judge didn't take long. In the hearing, he looked directly at Ethan. "You were told clearly to stop." Ethan tried to explain. Concern, confusion, wanting to help. The judge cut him off. "This is not help. This is interference." The order was granted. Immediate, enforceable. Any further attempt would carry penalties. After that, the social whisper stopped. Funny how fast stories die when courts speak. Weeks passed. Then months. No contact. No rumors. Just quiet again, but this time it felt earned. I settled back into my routines. But something had changed. I was more alert now. More aware of how easily affection can turn transactional. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not from Ethan. From his wife's parents. It was handwritten. Polite. Apologetic. They expressed regret for how things escalated. Claimed they never intended harm. Said they hoped time would heal wounds. I read it once. Then I filed it away. No response. Because apologies that arrive only after leverage fails aren't apologies. They're exits. The hardest moment came unexpectedly. At the grocery store. I ran into Ethan's daughter. She looked taller. Older. She smiled when she saw me. "Grandpa." My chest tightened. Her mother wasn't there. Just her. And a friend's parent. I knelt down and hugged her. We talked for 2 minutes. About school. About art class. Then she said, "Dad says you're mad at us." I chose my words carefully. "I'm not mad at you. Grown-up problems don't belong to kids." She nodded like she understood. Before leaving, she slipped something into my hand. A folded drawing. When I got home, I opened it. It was my house. With a sun. And me in the window. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. That drawing reminded me why boundaries matter. Not to punish, but to protect what's still good. The protective order changed Ethan's behavior overnight, not because it reached his conscience, but because it closed doors he had assumed would always be open. People like Ethan don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when there's nothing left to pull. For the first time since this all began, he had no access, no narrative control, no indirect leverage, no concerned son routine to hide behind. And that vacuum did something interesting. It forced him to live with the mess he'd made. I didn't hear about it from him. I heard about it the way you always hear about fallout, from the edges. It started with a call from an old acquaintance who worked in commercial lending. We hadn't spoken in years, but he'd seen my name on a legal filing and decided to reach out. "Robert," he said carefully, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but is your son having financial trouble?" I didn't answer right away. "Why do you ask?" He applied for a restructuring loan last week, listed anticipated family support as a mitigating factor. It raised questions. There it was, the assumption that I would still cushion the fall. I thanked him for the call and said nothing else. 2 days later, Gregory confirmed what I suspected. Ethan had been denied. Not just that loan, 2 others as well. When someone tries to leverage future inheritance or implied family backing, lenders pay attention. When that backing evaporates, confidence does too. Then came work. Ethan's employer, a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor, had been tolerant of his distractions during what they'd assumed was a family health issue. Missed calls, late reports, extended absences. That tolerance ended when rumors crossed desks. Not gossip, documentation. Someone, Gregory suspected a former client Ethan had tried to impress, had forwarded court records to the compliance department. Ethan wasn't accused of wrongdoing at work, but he was now flagged. In regulated industries, flags linger. Ethan was put on a performance plan, a quiet one, the kind that ends careers slowly. When pressure builds in one area, people look for release elsewhere. Ethan looked to family. I received a message from his sister-in-law, someone I'd barely interacted with before. It was polite, emotional, carefully worded. She talked about healing, about family unity, about how holding on to anger hurts everyone. She suggested mediation. I forwarded it to Gregory, without replying. Gregory's response was simple. "They're trying to bypass boundaries by appealing to guilt. Don't engage." I didn't. That silence did more damage than any argument could have. Because when manipulation stops working, desperation shows. The next attempt came through social services. A welfare check. 2 uniformed officers knocked on my door one morning, polite but formal. "We receive a report expressing concern for your well-being." I invited them in, offered coffee, and handed them copies of my most recent medical evaluations before they even asked. They read them carefully. Then one officer glanced up and said, "May I ask who submitted the concern?" I named Ethan. The officers exchanged a look. They apologized. "We see this sometimes," the older one said. "Family disputes framed as concern." They left within 10 minutes. And I knew this wasn't over, because Ethan had crossed a line, not legally, personally, using institutions meant to protect people as weapons. That night, I didn't sleep, not from fear, from clarity. There are moments when relationships don't fracture, they reveal their true shape. This was one of them. The next morning, I made a decision I'd been postponing. I asked Gregory to finalize changes we discussed months earlier but never enacted. He arrived that afternoon with documents. We sat at my dining table, sunlight cutting across the wood like lines on a map. "This isn't punitive," Gregory said as he reviewed the papers. "It's protective." I know. We updated the trust again. This time, the language was explicit. Ethan's access, present or future, was conditional not on reconciliation, but on conduct. No interference. No third-party manipulation. No attempts at control. Violation would trigger automatic exclusion. Not emotional. Automatic. Gregory also suggested something else. A letter, he said, not to argue, not to justify, to state facts. I agreed. We drafted it together. It was calm, direct, unemotional. It outlined boundaries, consequences, and expectations going forward. It acknowledged past support, but clarified that it did not create entitlement. It made one thing unmistakably clear. Any future relationship would be based on respect, or not exist at all. The letter was sent certified. Ethan received it 3 days later. I know because he showed up that evening. Unannounced. Standing on my porch. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it. You're not permitted to be here without notice. I just want to talk, he said. His voice sounded tired. Frayed. This is not the way. I got your letter, he said. You're serious. Yes. You'd really cut me out? I've already cut the behavior out. What happens next is up to you. There was a long silence. Then something I didn't expect. He laughed. A short, bitter sound. You know, he said, everyone thinks you're the victim here. I don't need anyone to think anything. That's the problem, he snapped. You don't care what anyone thinks. I paused before answering. No, I care what's true. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he said something revealing. I thought if I pushed hard enough, you'd cave. You always do. That sentence told me everything. Not anymore, I said. He stood there another minute. Then he left. After that, the silence was different. Not strategic. Exhausted. Months passed. Ethan stopped trying to control the narrative because there was no audience left willing to listen. Friends distanced themselves. Not because they knew the whole truth, but because inconsistency is contagious. People sense when stories don't add up. Work pressures mounted. Financial strain deepened. And without access to my stability, Ethan had to face his own. One afternoon, I received another letter. This one handwritten. From Ethan. It was shorter than I expected. No accusations. No justifications. Just acknowledgement. He wrote that he'd underestimated me. That he'd mistaken patience for weakness. That he didn't know who he was without leverage. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for money. He asked for time. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with it for days. Because boundaries aren't walls. They're filters. Eventually, I replied. Briefly, I'm open to rebuilding. Slowly. With transparency. Without intermediaries. That was all. No promises. No timelines. Some relationships don't reset. They reconfigure. And sometimes, the healthiest version looks nothing like the original. Time doesn't heal wounds. It reveals whether people are willing to stop reopening them. After my letter to Ethan, things didn't magically improve. They stabilized. And stability, I learned, is its own kind of test. Weeks passed before I heard from him again. No surprise visits. No third-party messages. No sudden emergencies designed to pull me back into old roles. Just silence. But unlike before, this silence didn't feel strategic. It felt unfamiliar to him. When Ethan finally reached out, it wasn't to ask for anything. It was to inform me. I moved out, he said over the phone. I waited. Out of the house? I asked. Yes. Another pause. Where are the kids? With me part-time. We're figuring things out. I could hear in his voice the strain of someone navigating consequences without a safety net. What happened? I asked. She said I'd change, he replied. That I wasn't ambitious anymore. That I'd let you poison me. I closed my eyes. So you left? No, he said quietly. She told me to. That didn't surprise me. Relationships built on leverage don't survive when leverage disappears. He didn't blame her outright. He didn't blame me either. That was new. Instead, he sounded confused, like someone realizing they'd been playing a role so long they forgot how to exist without a script. I'm staying in a small rental near the kids' school, he said. Nothing fancy. That's fine. I had to sell the car. I didn't comment. Work's unstable, he admitted. They extended the performance plan. I might be moved or let go. I'm sorry, I said and meant it, not because I regretted my boundaries, but because consequences are still painful, even when necessary. He exhaled slowly. I didn't realize how much I built my life, assuming you'd always be there to catch me. There it was. Not accusation. recognition. That assumption wasn't fair, I said. I know. We didn't talk long. 10 minutes, maybe. But when we hung up, something had shifted. Not reconciliation. Reality. A few days later, Gregory called. I wanted you to be aware, he said. Ethan's wife has consulted counsel. For what? Possibly custody leverage. Possibly financial discovery. My jaw tightened. Gregory continued calmly. Nothing actionable yet, but it confirmed something important. What's that? She still believes resources are accessible through pressure. And she's wrong. We prepared anyway. Not defensively, thoroughly. Documentation updated. Trust reaffirmed. Instructions clarified. Not because I feared losing control. Because I refused to leave ambiguity behind me. That decision proved wise. 2 weeks later, I received a subpoena request. Not directly, but through Gregory. Ethan's wife's attorney had requested disclosure of potential familial financial support structures. Gregory responded with a firm refusal. No obligation. No standing. No relevance. The request was withdrawn. That was the last legal maneuver. After that, things slowed. Life resumed its quieter rhythms. I returned to my routines. Morning walks. Reading. Volunteer accounting work at a local nonprofit. Evenings where the house felt calm instead of echoing. But emotional fallout doesn't follow schedules. One afternoon, months later, there was a knock on my door. It was Ethan. This time, he had followed the rules. Written notice. Clear intent. Respectful tone. I let him in. He looked older. Not physically, internally. We sat across from each other in the living room. The same space where so much tension had once lived. I'm not here to ask for help, he said quickly. Or forgiveness. I nodded. I just needed to tell you something. I waited. I started therapy, he said. That surprised me. Not because of the marriage, he added. Because of me. I stayed silent. I realized something uncomfortable, he continued. I learned to confuse control with responsibility. I thought being in charge meant being entitled. That's a hard realization, I said. I know, and I don't expect anything from you because of it. That mattered. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about money. He didn't ask about changing documents. He asked about me, how I was sleeping, what I'd been reading, whether I still walked in the mornings. We talked for nearly an hour. When he left, there was no hug, just a quiet understanding. After that, we began something new, not a father-son relationship as it once was. Something smaller, more deliberate, occasional coffee, brief updates, no assumptions. Trust, I learned, doesn't return in floods. It seeps. His wife, on the other hand, did not let go so easily. The final attempt came 6 months later. I received a letter from a mediation firm. She wanted a family reconciliation session. Gregory reviewed it. This is about optics, he said, not resolution. We declined. No explanation. No counteroffer. Just a boundary. That refusal ended things. Sometimes the end doesn't come with a bang. It comes with a door that never opens again. The children remain the most complicated part. I miss them constantly, but I did not chase access. I did not use them as leverage. I waited. Eventually, time did what pressure never could. They grew. They asked questions. Ethan answered honestly, more honestly than before. And one afternoon, a year after the incident, my granddaughter showed up at my door with Ethan. She wanted to see you, he said simply. We spent the afternoon drawing. No heavy conversations. No explanations. Just presence. That, I realized, was the real victory. Not proving I was right, but refusing to become bitter. The visit with my granddaughter changed something I didn't expect. Not in Ethan. In me. For months, I've been telling myself I was at peace. That I'd drawn my boundaries, protected myself, and moved on. And that was mostly true. But peace built on vigilance still requires effort. You're always braced for impact, even when nothing is coming. That afternoon, markers spread across my dining table. her feet swinging beneath the chair, her asking if clouds have feelings. I felt something loosen. I wasn't waiting for the next problem. I was just there. After they left, I sat alone longer than usual. The house didn't feel empty. It felt complete. And that's when I realized something quietly unsettling. I didn't want my old life back. Not the version where I was central. Not the version where my value was measured by availability. Not the version where family meant obligation instead of choice. I wanted something cleaner, simpler, final. That thought stayed with me for weeks. I didn't rush it. I didn't announce it. I just let it sit, like you let a glass settle after pouring wine, waiting for the sediment to drop. Then one morning, I called Gregory. I want to make one last change. I told him. His voice sharpened, not with alarm, but attention. Go on. I want to transfer the house into the trust. Fully, irrevocably. There was a pause. That's significant, he said carefully. I know. It means you no longer personally own it. Yes. And it removes it entirely from any future claims, negotiations, or emotional leverage. That's the point. He exhaled. Most people hesitate at that step. I'm not most people anymore. We scheduled the paperwork. But before signing anything, Gregory asked a question he'd never asked me before. Do you want to tell Ethan? I thought about it. I don't owe him advance notice, I said. No, you don't. But I don't want him to find out accidentally either. We agreed I would tell him, after the documents were executed. That detail mattered, because this wasn't discussion. It was a fact. The signing took place on a quiet Thursday afternoon. No ceremony. No witnesses beyond what was legally required. No emotion theatrics. Just signatures, dates, and a sense of finality that surprised me with how calm it felt. When it was done, Gregory slid the folder across the table. It's complete, he said. There's no reversing this without your explicit consent. And even then, only under narrow circumstances. Good. You're sure? I didn't hesitate. I've never been more sure of anything. He nodded, then smiled faintly. Most people wait until something is taken from them. You chose to release it yourself. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not deeply, but without tension. I called Ethan 2 days later. I didn't invite him over. I didn't soften my tone. I didn't frame it as reassurance. I told him the truth. I've placed the house fully into the trust, I said. It no longer belongs to me personally. He was quiet. And, he asked, and it means there is no scenario, present or future, where it becomes a bargaining chip. Not for you. Not for anyone. Another pause. You're selling it? He asked. No. Then why? Because I'm done living with one eye on the door. He didn't argue. That surprised me. I wish you'd told me sooner, he said eventually. I'm telling you now. Does this mean I'm out? I chose my words carefully. It means you're not in control, and you never were meant to be. That landed. I'm not angry, he said. Just trying to understand. I know. He didn't ask if the kids were still beneficiaries. He didn't ask about timelines. He didn't ask about inheritance percentages. Those absences told me more than questions ever could. After we hung up, I felt something settle permanently. Not relief, resolution. But life doesn't respect closure. It tests it. 3 weeks later, the final confrontation arrived. Not from Ethan, from her. I was returning from the grocery store when I saw her car parked across the street. I stopped, didn't approach, just stood there, keys in hand, assessing. She stepped out. I just want to talk, she said. No, I replied calmly. She scoffed. You can't avoid me forever. I'm not avoiding you. I'm choosing not to engage. You owe me an explanation. I don't owe you anything. She stepped closer. You destroyed my family. I met her eyes. No, I said evenly. I stopped allowing access. That's the same thing. It isn't. Her voice rose. You turned Ethan against me. I stopped shielding him from reality. You manipulated him. I withdrew. She laughed bitterly. You think you're some kind of moral authority? No, I said, I think I'm done. That seemed to enrage her more than anything else. You think this ends with you? She snapped. You think there aren't consequences? I think there already were, I said, and I accepted mine. She stared at me, breathing hard. You're cold, she said finally. No, I corrected. I'm finished. I walked past her, unlocked my door, and went inside. I did not look back. The next morning, Gregory called. She contacted our office. He said, attempted to challenge the trust on emotional coercion grounds. And she has no standing. We shut it down. Good. That should be the end of it. It was. No more letters. No more intermediaries. No more pressure disguised as concern. Time passed. Ethan stabilized. Not dramatically, but genuinely. He moved into a smaller place closer to the kids' school. Changed apartments at work. Started showing up consistently instead of impressively. We saw each other once every few weeks. Always neutral territory. Always brief. Always respectful. And the kids? They grew comfortable again. Not with expectations. With presence. I stopped thinking about the house as an asset. It became what it always should have been. A place to live. Not leverage. Not legacy. Not bait. One evening, months later, as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Older. Calmer. Unburdened. I hadn't won. I hadn't punished anyone. I had simply refused to continue a cycle. That choice didn't fix everything, but it ended something that needed to end. And in doing so, it created space for something quieter, something honest, something that didn't need defending. The quiet that followed surprised me, not the absence of phone calls or letters. I expected that. It was the way my body responded. My shoulders stopped tightening when the doorbell rang. My chest no longer braced itself before checking messages. Even my sleep changed. I stopped waking at 3 a.m, replaying conversations that no longer mattered. For the first time in years, nothing was waiting to erupt. Peace didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in, like warmth after a long winter, slow and almost suspicious at first. Weeks passed, then months. The legal dust settled completely. No further challenges. No veiled threats. No attempts at accidental encounters. Gregory confirmed everything was airtight. The trust stood untouched, and with it, my autonomy. Ethan adjusted. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But honestly, he didn't ask for money again. He didn't ask for access. He didn't ask me to soften anything. Instead, he started showing up differently. When we met for coffee, he listened more than he spoke. When he talked about work, there was less boasting and more realism. He no longer framed his struggles as injustices someone else should fix. He owned them. That mattered more to me than apologies. One afternoon, months later, he surprised me. I sold the car, he said casually, stirring his coffee. The expensive one? I asked. Yeah. Why? I didn't need it, he said simply. I think I liked how it made me look more than how it made me feel. That sentence told me everything. We didn't hug. We didn't revisit the past. We just sat there, two adults, no longer locked in a power struggle neither of us should have been part of. The kids thrived. They didn't know about trust or boundaries or legal safeguards. They just knew Grandpa showed up when he said he would, that he listened, that he didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. One evening, my granddaughter asked me something unexpected. Why don't you ever yell? She asked. I smiled. I used to. Why don't you now? I thought for a moment. Because I learned that quiet decisions last longer. She nodded like that made perfect sense. Children understand truth better than adults give them credit for. As the seasons change, so did my routines. I downsized my expectations before I ever downsized my life. I stopped hosting big gatherings, stopped performing holidays, stopped measuring my worth by usefulness. Instead, I focused on sustainability, morning walks, community classes, lunches that lasted longer than they needed to. I even took a trip alone, not to escape, not to prove anything, just because I could.